Good to have you back as we continue with week 2 of the 4th installment of church history, looking at the modern age. So the end of the 18th, 19th, 20th, into the 21st century. You can see from your handout that we are looking at someone who may be unfamiliar to many or most of you, but is a name that you definitely should know in American history and in church history. I wanted to do at least one person in this last unit that would give some entree into the tradition of the black church, which is not my expertise and not, of course, what I grew up in, but is a very important part of the American tradition. And this is you can see a preacher, pastor, you'll hear all about him, who is worth celebrating, worth knowing about. So you can just look, here are a few, these two, there were 3 paintings done in his lifetime. This one on the bottom left-hand corner was not a painting, but you can see that's an engraving done later. But these two, and then this is one in his old age that's on the cover of this book. So I read this biography this week. It has great information. It has a little bit of a progressive slant on some things, but if you wanted to read it, you could certainly benefit from it. Freedom's Prophet, and much smaller, and from Richard Allen himself. This is only 75 pages. The first half of this is his autobiography, so you could really read his autobiography in probably an hour, and I'm going to quote from it in several places, and then appended to this are several other pamphlets and documents. And wherever possible, when you're learning history, doing history, when you can go to the primary sources, read what people wrote themselves, I always find it most illuminating and edifying. So this is just a short little thing. You can order both of these on Amazon. You can see the picture here, and then on the back, what you'll hear about is this famous church. Will Ross, you're a Pennsylvanian. Have you ever been by this church?
Yes, I have.
Yes, so this building is the 4th building to stand on this site. You can see quite a lovely interior there. It's affectionately known as Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. The website, which does have a lot of helpful information about history and about Richard Allen, and of course the AME, like a lot of older denominations, would have things besides being Methodist that we wouldn't agree with, and yet you can look at that Mother Bethel site and you'll get a lot of history. On the corner of 6th and Lombard Streets in Center City, Philadelphia, only a few blocks from Independence Hall. I bet many of us have been by Independence Hall, have stood in line to see the Liberty Bell. And just a little word to Wise, they now have a window at the end of that. You don't even have to wait in line, because it is cool, but it is a bell. And you can just kind of skip and just look in the window and get your picture and say, there it is. But only a few blocks from Independence Hall stands one of the most important churches in the country. The current church building, as I said, is the 4th church structure on the site. The first edifice was a blacksmith shop moved to that location, so I'm not quite sure how they moved a whole shop. They tore it down and rebuilt it, or they put it on some sort of wagon, but they moved a blacksmith shop and converted it into a house of worship. And fittingly, when the church was dedicated on July 29, 1794, it was dedicated as the Blacksmith Shop Meeting House. Thankfully, that name did not last very long, because during the service, a neighboring pastor prayed about this church that it might be a Bethel, taken from Genesis 28:19, a Bethel for the ingathering of souls, and the name stuck. And from that time on, it would be known as Bethel Church or Bethel Methodist Episcopal Church. Given its crucial history in the founding of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which we'll come to by the end of class, abbreviated as the AME, given its history for the AME and in the black church tradition more broadly, the church today is simply known as Mother Bethel. That property on the corner of 6th and Lombard Street in Philadelphia can boast of being the oldest parcel of land continuously owned by blacks in the United States. Richard Allen purchased that piece of property in 1791, and I suppose these things can be hard to know for certain, but everyone says this, the website says it, all the books say it, the oldest continuously owned piece of property by African Americans in this country. And it was purchased by a man who founded the AME, who founded that church, who can be in many ways called a black founding father in this country, a former slave turned Methodist preacher named Richard Allen. Richard Allen was born as a slave in Philadelphia on February 14. Many people noted the Valentine's Day connection. February 14, 1760. His master was a very famous lawyer named Benjamin Chew. He was a well-known lawyer born into a Quaker family in 1722. This man, Chew, was close friends with George Washington. He was the personal lawyer for the Penn family, of course, of Pennsylvania. He rose to become the Attorney General in Pennsylvania. Later, he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the province and then later the state of Pennsylvania. He was a wealthy man and he was a slave owner. He held several properties, one there in Philadelphia, sort of near the river. Philadelphia has the Delaware and then the Schuylkill. That's the one that is hard to pronounce on this side. So over here, he had another property up in what today is Germantown, which would be pretty near toward Westminster Seminary is. And then he had another property just over the border south in Delaware. Can't be certain in which one of these he was born, but most of the sources say he was born in Philadelphia. When Allen was 7 years old, this man, Chew, sold him and his family to a Delaware planter named Stokely Sturgis. Some interesting names here. Chew, Stokely, Sturgis. When Allen was 17 years old, so he sold to another master at age 7. When he is 17, an itinerant Methodist minister named Freeborn Garretson. You might think with the name Freeborn that maybe he was a former slave or black, but he wasn't. He was a white man. Freeborn Garretson, who passed by on a preaching tour. This man, Garretson, was one of the most effective and best American-born Methodist preachers. So this lecture is going to have a lot with Methodist history, which is not the same as Presbyterian history, but some names you may have heard before. Francis Asbury, Thomas Coke. You've probably heard of Asbury College, Asbury Seminary. That's named after Francis Asbury, who was the leader of the Methodist movement in America for over 30 years. Well, these two men, Asbury and Coke, were actually born in England and in Wales, respectively. This man, Garretson, was American-born. And he preached, and Allen was converted. And listen to how Allen describes his conversion. And this is in his autobiography, which he wrote at the end of his life. And he describes it in very Wesleyan terms. It will sound a lot like a hymn that you know. He says, "My sins were a heavy burden. I was tempted to believe there was no mercy for me. I cried to the Lord both night and day. One night I thought hell would be my portion. I cried unto him who delighteth to hear the prayers of a poor sinner, and all of a sudden my dungeon shook, my chains flew off, and glory to God I cried. My soul was filled, I cried, enough for me the Savior died. Now my confidences were strengthened that the Lord, for Christ's sake, had heard my prayers and pardoned all my sins. Sounds a lot like Charles Wesley's hymn, And Can It Be? Allen joined the local Methodist Society. He began attending John Gray. He was a well-known class leader for several years. One of the geniuses in the Methodist movement was it was very organized. If you were here last year when I did a lecture on John Wesley, Wesley has a lot of strengths and a lot of weaknesses, in particular his relationships with women. He was not real smooth. One of his geniuses, though, he was a master organizer. One of the reasons Methodism could spread is it was divided into these various societies and then classes we might call little churches or even small groups, and so he joined this class. Come back to this man, Stokely Sturgis. He was not a Christian, but he was, according to Allen, quote, what the world called a good master. He was more like a father to his slaves than anything else. He was a very tender human man. Now that certainly wasn't the case for all slaves, but it was the case for Richard Allen. Some years earlier, Sturgis fell on hard times, and he sold most of Allen's family away. 3 of the children remained. So he says he was a good man, but he did split apart the family, fell on hard times, and so Allen says his mother became a very pious woman. We don't know what happened to his father. Some sources say that his father was African and his mother was biracial, black and white, as often was the case, but he remained with his brother and his sister. Now, when they became Christians, all 3 of them became Christians, the word on the street was that they would be worse slaves now that they were Christians. And in fact, Sturgis gave them freedom to go to Methodist meetings as often as they wanted to. All right, that's good. He wasn't a Christian, not a converted man. You can go to the meetings, and so many of the neighbors said, now we'll see what happens. He is too indulgent with his slaves. They become Christians, and then they think they don't have to work anymore. Allen, however, and this says something very important about his character, and it will carry throughout his life, and the way in which he wanted to work for African American equality and uplift. He thought, all right, I am going to be the absolute best slave to my master that I can be. And so he and his siblings were motivated, and he said, even when he let us go to the meetings, we said, we're going to get our crops done first. He wanted to show that Christianity made him better. Allen later wrote, our master said he was convinced that religion made slaves better, not worse, and often boasted of his slaves for their honesty and industry. Now, sometime later, we don't know exactly when, Allen asked if he might have some Methodist preachers come preach to the house. Now, we don't know if this was only, I like these Methodist preachers. He wanted his master to be converted. He was a very entrepreneurial, shrewd, wise young man. He likely knew the sort of message that his master was going to hear, because the Methodists, give credit where credit is due, the Methodists were among the first and strongest abolitionists. So many of the Methodist leaders were anti-slavery advocates. So Sturgis and his wife are old by this point, infirmed, and they gladly agree, certainly, Allen, you can come have these Methodist preachers you think so highly of, come to our house, to our property, and preach. Eventually, this man, who was the instrument of Allen's conversion, Freeborn Garretson, comes. And he not only preaches the gospel, he preaches a message why slavery is sinful, and if you have your slaves with you, they don't let you into heaven. Took some guts. He preached on the text from Daniel, "Thou art weighed in the balance and art found wanting." And it was a message directly for Stokely Sturgis. God's grace, Sturgis is not only converted, he's convinced that slavery is wrong. And he agrees. Now you might think, well, he just said, be free. That's not what he did. But he agreed to pay Allen as a slave, and he could purchase his freedom for 2,000 continental dollars, which was a significant sum of money. It would take about normally 5 years for someone working very hard, very industriously as a slave in that arrangement to make enough money to pay off his freedom. For his freedom. Allen was elated by the prospect of finally being free. He says, even though Stokely was, quote, a kind, affectionate, and tender-hearted master, slavery was still, quote, a bitter pill. So we shouldn't put too much of a gloss on it that he just said, this is great, I love being a slave. Obviously he didn't. He dreamt his whole life about being free, and he said he had a very strong impression from the Lord that one day he would be free. So he works incredibly hard as a slave. He picks up odd jobs. He chops down trees. He hauls salt. He works for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, any sort of odd jobs. And instead of 5 years, it takes him 3 years. So this arrangement is made in 1780. And then in 1783, September, he is able to purchase his freedom. And he was known up to that point, if you would have looked at some records, as Negro Richard. And he took the surname Allen. Anyone with the surname Allen in this group? I know we have some in the church. We don't know why he did. The biographer says he took that secret to the grave with him, why he became Richard Allen, but he did. In September of 1783, he's a free man, 23 years old. And he begins an itinerant preaching ministry. So he comes together with other Methodist leaders, almost all white, and he travels through the Mid-Atlantics, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. In the winter of 1784, this is a very important bit of Methodist history. There's something in the winter of 1784 called the Christmas Conference. This marks the official establishment of the Methodist Episcopal Church. So Methodism came out of the Church of England. Episcopal refers to its church polity. Episcopalian means ruled by bishops. So Methodists have bishops. This was a very auspicious beginning as John Wesley ordains elders. Is really no authority from the Church of England to do so, but he does, and they establish they're not going to be a part of the Church of England. They are going to be the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, many, many years later, through different mergers, eventually this will become the United Methodist Church, which we're more familiar with. And Allen was at this meeting in 1784. Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke were elected the first superintendents, and Asbury would lead the Methodists in America for the next 32 years. The numbers related to Francis Asbury are mind-boggling. He averaged 6,000 miles on horseback each year. I don't know if you just commute, if you drive in some cars 6,000 miles each year. And he preached virtually every single day and often more than once. I mean, he may have preached 300, 400, 500 times a year for more than 3 decades. That's what Methodism did. And they insisted on you didn't have to have a tremendous amount of education, you didn't get paid very much money, and itinerant ministry was the name of the game over many wide dispersed places. You see how in the 19th century, the 3 At the start of the 19th century, the three main religious expressions will be Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, maybe Church of England, Anglican. But by the end of the 19th century, Methodists and Baptists just grow so much faster than Presbyterians. And it is one of the strengths and weaknesses of both various traditions, because Presbyterians have always insisted on a very educated clergy. And that means more attention to theology, more attention to biblical preaching, more attention to all sorts of things that we love and appreciate. And it also means it's a little harder to multiply and to get pastors. And it becomes, Presbyterianism will become a denomination that struggles to reach the lower classes, while Methodism and Baptists are just get on a horse, go out there, preach some sermons, you got a church. They're different ways, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. During the time of Francis Asbury, the Methodist Church grew from around 1,000 members to over 200,000. So that's a pretty good growth rate. Now, Asbury, who is the dominant Methodist leader in America, thought very highly of this young African American. He would have been called an exhorter. He's not ordained. And he invited Richard Allen to travel with him and preach together in the Carolinas. Asbury said, I'll take care of you. I know down there in the Carolinas is different than up here in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. I'll give you food, I'll give you clothing, I'll make sure you're lodged, I'll make sure you're safe. And Allen feared, probably not without reason, that if he happened to get sick, because people get sick all the time, and if he had to be left behind in the Carolinas, he might be poorly treated, or in fact, he might be re-enslaved. So he said, I'm not going to go with you. It's too dangerous for me to go down to the Carolinas. He declined. But it says something about the way in which Asbury respected Richard Allen. 1786, the church in Philadelphia called St. George's, that's the Methodist church in Philadelphia. The presiding elder there asks Allen to return to his hometown and if he would preach to the black members of the church. Philadelphia is, this point, the third largest city in the British Atlantic orbit, and it was a magnet for free blacks. Now, as we'll see throughout this lesson, there was still plenty of discrimination and animus, but Pennsylvania was likely the best state in the Union at this time for blacks. It was the only place, one black philanthropist would say, where blacks and whites could somewhat be treated as equals. That was from James Forten, who was a black, wealthy shipbuilder in Philadelphia. So he comes back in 1786 to St. George's Church, and he's preaching to the black congregation. Now, from 1787 to 1793, the chronology gets a bit fuzzy. Richard Allen has one chronology, and modern historians think, well, he wrote that 40 years later. We're not sure he remembered it correctly. So they have a different chronology, and both have plausibility. But I'll just tell the story as Richard Allen tells it. By the end of 1786, Allen had established a small black congregation within St. George's of 42 members. He was given the unenviable time of preaching to them at 5 a.m. Allen said he preached not only at 5 a.m., he preached in the evening, and he would preach at other locations around the city, sometimes 4 or 5 times on a Sunday. Allen saw the need for establishing a separate church for black Christians rather than existing as a segregated ministry within the white church. Now, that idea was shot down. You know who didn't like it? Everyone. Free blacks didn't like it. White leaders at St. George certainly didn't like it. But as Allen's following continued to grow, the leaders at St. George's became less and less accommodating. Now, They had the idea in the first place, but as the church was growing and becoming more pronounced, they became more nervous about it. The breaking point came one Sunday. Racial tension spilled over into the church service. Again, this event happened on Allen's telling in 1787. Other historians think it was really 1792 or 93. But here's the important event. That same year, so Allen puts it in 1787. Remember your American history, 1787 in Philadelphia. There's some people writing a constitution just blocks away. Just as importantly, the Presbyterians are also meeting to establish their constitution. And people said if you would have opened the doors of both places, you might have been able to hear speaking. They were almost literally a stone's throw away from each other. So some historians think, well, Richard Allen misremembered, or maybe he wanted to put it in 1787 because that was sort of after 76, 1787 in Philadelphia is a mythical year of new beginnings and freedom. He had founded in 1787, along with another preacher who will figure very prominently in this story, a preacher named Absalom Jones. They had founded something called the FAS, the Free African Society. There, not to be confused, there was also a PAS, which was the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. This is the Free African Society, and this is a group led by blacks to help with blacks who are destitute, who are infirmed, who need help, maybe need housing, need a job. Now, Allen only lasted in this for about a year because he wanted it to become an explicitly Methodist organization, but it was non-denominational. It had a lot of Quaker influence. There's lots of Quakers in Philadelphia, but it was significant. He founded this in 1787. Now, what happened one Sunday has become, certainly in this tradition, a bit of justly famous lore. Now, I don't mean lore that it didn't happen. It did happen. And I'll let Richard Allen describe the scene one Sunday in St. George's. The sexton, that's the building and grounds, the janitor, the sexton told us to go and we would see where to sit. He's talking about the blacks who were there at St. George's. We expected to take the seats over the ones we formerly occupied below. So there's a balcony. This is one of the reasons some scholars think this happened later because this balcony was not created yet. But maybe he means something else. So he says that they always sat in the front. So these blacks who would attend a 5 a.m. service just for them, many of them also attended the regular service with the whole congregation. And one Sunday, the sexton tells them, this is almost Rosa Parks-ish, you can't sit in your normal seat. We had not been long upon our knees before I heard considerable scuffling and low talking. I raised my head up and saw one of the trustees, and this is in keeping with the time, they just give initials, HM. So this man doesn't have to live in infamy, HM. Having hold of the Reverend Absalom Jones, pulling him up off his knees and saying, you must get up, you must not kneel here. Mr. Jones replied, wait until prayer is over. Mr. H.M. said, no, you must get up now, or I will call for aid and force you away. Mr. Jones said, wait until prayer is over, and I will get up and trouble you no more. With that, he beckoned one of the other trustees, Mr. L.S., to come to his assistance. He came and went to William White to pull him up. By this time, the prayer was over. So there's this thing happening in the middle of a prayer in the service. Absalom Jones is there. Say, get up. No, you can't sit here. And he's just, let me finish. Let me pray. No, you can't. I will forcibly remove you. By the time the prayer is over and the men are ready to exit them out, Allen says, we all went out of the church in a body, and they were no more plagued with us in the church. This raised such a great excitement and inquiry among the citizens, and so much that I believe they were ashamed of their conduct. But my dear Lord was with us, and we were filled with fresh vigor to get a house erected to worship God in. Very dramatic scene in Mass. The black congregation, you don't want us here, we walk out. From this point, Allen and Jones set out to establish an independent black church in Philadelphia. They face threats, discrimination, but they also are successful in gathering subscription papers. So this is just a good old-fashioned capital campaign, and they're canvassing for pledges to raise money. And in his autobiography, and this also says something very important about Allen's character and his willingness to find what was commendable in the people around him. He says in his autobiography, two white men in particular came to his aid. Quote, "By the time we had waited on Dr. Rush and Mr. Robert Ralston and told them of our distressing situation, we considered it a blessing that the Lord had put into our hearts to wait upon those gentlemen. They pitied our situation, they subscribed largely toward the church, and were very friendly towards us, and advised us how to go on. We appointed Mr. Ralston our treasurer. Dr. Rush did much for us in public by his influence." Let me remind you who these two men are. You probably haven't heard of the second one, but I hope you've heard of Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush in the founding era is like the Forrest Gump of the founders, in that everywhere you turn, he's just there. He's always there. He's always doing something. He was a doctor, philanthropist, abolitionist. He is the signer of the Declaration of Independence. Now, a little factoid about history, he wasn't at any of the proceedings in Independence Hall in June and July. Remember, the signing and the John Hancock with the big letters, they didn't sign it then. They left it there in Philadelphia, and for the next month in August, they said, come back and sign it. Well, he wasn't there, but he wanted to sign it anyways. So he's one of the signers, kind of snuck on the back way, and now he can be famous as one of the 56 signers. He was a young physician training in Edinburgh and was instrumental in getting none other than all of our favorite person, John Witherspoon, from Scotland to leave and come to America. In fact, Benjamin Rush at one point said he married his wife, Julia Stockton, I think, of the famous Stockton family. He married her in large part because she thought so highly of John Witherspoon's sermons. Now, we got to be fair. Benjamin Rush, by the end of his life, was not nearly the orthodox evangelical Presbyterian he was earlier in life. He dabbled in a lot of different things, and today many Unitarian Universalists would consider him one of the early Unitarian Universalists. So he ended in a worse spot theologically than he started, but he was a dynamic founding father, and here they say, we want to thank Dr. Benjamin Rush, who gave generously to this and was a support. And then Robert Ralston. He was a wealthy merchant in Philadelphia, and he most certainly was a Presbyterian and an evangelical. He founded the first Bible Society in America. He became the first president of the Board of Education for the Presbyterian Church. So this layman, Mr. Robert Ralston, gave very generously. He was the first treasurer for this work of planting this black church. Allen continues, I hope the name of Dr. Benjamin Rush and Mr. Robert Ralston will never be forgotten among us. They were the first two gentlemen who espoused the cause of the oppressed and aided us in building the house of the Lord for the poor Africans to worship in. Here was the beginning and the rise of the first African church in America. The elder at St. George's continued to oppose Allen and Jones. He threatened to erase their names and their followers from the rolls, but they continued to raise funds for a separate church. In 1791, as I said at the beginning, Richard Allen purchased that piece of property on the corner of 6th and Lombard Street. But that was not actually the place where the first black church was built, because the committee in charge of the work preferred a lot on 5th Street. Allen tells very dramatically he put the first spade into the ground, digging up the foundation for this first church independently for Africans erected in America. So you say, if that on 5th Street became the first, why isn't that Mother Bethel? Well, there's a story. The committee that is organizing this work, kind of doing a church plant, they understandably were becoming frustrated with the Methodists because they came from St. George's, and the Methodists are not being real friendly to us. And so they took a vote, what denomination do we want this to be? And by a clear majority, they voted to be a part of the Church of England, to be a part of the Episcopal Church. Allen said, I am so committed to the Methodist Church. And he had reasons for it. He thought the discipline of the Methodist Church, the simplicity of their services, the simplicity of the gospel, he thought was more suited for slave people or for his constituency. He said that he wanted, quote, plain doctrine and good discipline. So he says, God bless you. And Absalom Jones becomes the pastor at that church. It becomes St. Thomas, and it's a part of the Episcopal Church, not the Methodist Church. So they arrange a new committee, and he says, well, I still have this piece of land on 6th and Lombard that he purchased, he and his wife, and they start a new work there, and the committee appoints him to be the pastor. And on July 29, 1794, the church is dedicated. And who preaches the dedication sermon? Francis Asbury, which was a great boost from the most important Methodist leader, white man, to say, I will be here and I will preach this dedication service at the Blacksmith Meeting House. Now, that's 1794. There is a significant event that happens in 1793 that put the whole thing on pause. A very famous part in American history that we've probably forgotten, but there was much worse than COVID. There was a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. Early reports out of the West Indies, so now we know that this came by way of mosquitoes. Do you know, by a factor of like 100 to 1, the deadliest animal in the history of our planet is the mosquito. It ain't sharks or bears or lions, it's the mosquito. Came on a ship from the West Indies. Well, there were early reports. I don't know if they were accurate or made up or they just didn't get the rest of the story, but early reports said when this fever hit the West Indies, the black population wasn't affected. So a doctor of the credentials of Benjamin Rush, no less, and many other people believed that this epidemic will not affect the black population. Proved to be inaccurate. Benjamin Rush and others seem to have held to the view very honestly. So as this is ravaging Philadelphia, Benjamin Rush and other leaders call upon Allen and Jones, thinking erroneously that blacks won't be affected, if they might care for the ailing population. And quite heroically, the Free African Society, Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, their constituency, they respond with great courage and compassion. Most often, in fact, Allen says, we did this for over 800 patients. They would go in, and Rush believed that the only way to get rid of the fever was to bleed people. So imagine, these are not trained doctors, not trained nurses. You maybe have Benjamin Rush giving you a half-hour tutorial, and you go around the city and you're cutting people. You're bleeding them. They had to go and dress wounds. They had to attend to the sick and the dying. They had to be grave diggers. They had to be notaries. They were the ones who were taking care of the population. Now, tragically, the reports of their immunity to the disease proved to be false. Blacks caught the disease and died in equal proportion to whites. Most of his adult life, Richard Allen lived at 105 Spruce Street, which is, as the blocks go, so that's down by the Delaware side, not far from where the White House was during these years, because the seat of government is in Philadelphia. And there's a very fascinating story where Richard Allen, he also owned a chimney sweep company. Of course he did. And he went to George Washington's house to provide chimney sweep services. Likely Allen didn't do it himself, but they may have met. Some people speculate maybe George Washington even read his anti-slavery pamphlet. But on his Spruce Street neighborhood, more than half of the houses were empty. People either fled or they simply died. And often blacks were hit harder because they didn't have the money to flee and go somewhere else. As the plague was winding down by the end of 1793, a newspaper editor named Matthew Carey writes a piece accusing blacks of behaving shamefully during the epidemic. He charged them, okay, you guys, your Free African Society, you charged exorbitant prices, you took advantage of people, you stole from people when you were in their homes, and he lodges these very serious allegations. This prompted a published response from Allen and Jones. They detailed, and it's in that little autobiography there, they detailed how little most blacks were actually paid, how steadfastly they carried out the work, and how many of them suffered and died. It tells a story of one man said, if you come near my house, I'll shoot you. And then later that afternoon, they were digging his grave. He had died. They published a pamphlet in 1794 by the Philadelphia printer William Woodward, which stuck in my head because I know that is the man who would publish 8 years later the complete works of John Witherspoon. So he publishes this pamphlet by these two black authors, and it represented the first federal copyright issued to black authors in the United States. So the first copyrighted work by black authors. Now there have been other blacks who tell their stories or poetry, but copyrighted authors. In it, Allen thanked Rush. Far from saying, Benjamin Rush, you made a mess of us, he said, I thank Benjamin Rush for giving us the opportunity to be so useful to our fellow citizens. Now, before the pamphlet was published, Allen and Jones had written Philadelphia's mayor, Matthew Clarkson, to explain what had really happened. Clarkson wrote a reply, and then with some courage, he allowed this to be printed along with the pamphlet. And one of the things we see here is that people are people. If you want to make this a story of whites discriminating against blacks, there's plenty of that. And there are also plenty evidences at this time of whites not doing that. And Matthew Clarkson was one of them. Took some courage for the mayor of Philadelphia to allow this paragraph to be printed along with their pamphlet. January 7, 1794. From Matthew Clarkson, the mayor. Having, during the prevalence of the late malignant disorder, had almost daily opportunities of seeing the conduct of Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, and the people employed with them to bury the dead, I with cheerfulness give this testimony of my approbation of their proceedings, so far as they came under my notice. Their diligence, attention, and decency of deportment afforded me all the time much satisfaction. So it was significant that the mayor said, I was in contact with these men all the time, and I only saw them and their people behave with decency and deportment. At the back of the pamphlet, Allen also managed to include a short but significant piece called An Address to Those Who Keep Slaves and Approve the Practice. Again, remember, Philadelphia is the national seat of government. And in this little pamphlet, Allen makes three basic arguments against slavery. One, if you would give blacks a chance, you will see they are not inferior in mental endowment. So that was one of the arguments. So blacks are not suited for freedom. He said, try being raised in slavery and see what you're like. Give us a chance, see what we can do. Second, he said, look at the story of the Israelites in Egypt, and you will see, quote, God himself was the first pleader of the cause of slaves. And third argument, he says, if you love your children and you love your country, you will get rid of slaves. This is interesting, and many abolitionists will make this argument, saying this is not just for the good of the slaves, this is for the good of the whole country. This is going to be a plague upon our country if we don't get rid of this. This is for your benefit as well. Now, it can be argued that later in life, Allen became a little less optimistic about the prospects for racial harmony and the end of slavery. It's one of the sad realizations in American history is that by the time you get to the middle of the 19th century, black-white relations have gotten worse and positions have intensified. Now, there always were north-south divisions, but just to give you one example, in 1787, the Synod of New York and Philadelphia, that's the National Presbyterian Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, which splits later in the Southern Presbyterian Church, and then the PCA comes out of this. So this is our great-grandfather denomination. 1787, their synod, their General Assembly, passes this, and they later restate the very same thing in 1794. The Synod of New York and Philadelphia, these are the Presbyterians, us, do highly approve of the general principles in favor of universal liberty that prevail in America, and the interest which many of the states have taken in promoting the abolition of slavery. Pennsylvania passed in 1780 the Gradual Abolition of Slavery Act. It was the first abolition act anywhere in the Western world, in Pennsylvania. And it said that any slave born after the date of this in 1780 shall be freed at no later than 28 years of age. So it was a gradual abolition act. So that's in the background, 1787. The Presbyterians continue. Yet inasmuch as men introduced into a servile state to a participation of all the privileges of civil society, without a proper education, without previous habits of industry, may, in many respects, be dangerous to the community, therefore, they earnestly recommended to all the members belonging to their communion to give those persons who are at present held in servitude such good education as may prepare them for the better enjoyment of freedom. Saying, you should be educating your slaves to prepare them for freedom. Then here's the last paragraph. And they, the Synod, moreover, recommend that masters, wherever they find servants disposed to make a proper improvement of the privilege, would give them some share of property to begin with, or grant them sufficient time and sufficient means of procuring by industry their own liberty at a moderate rate, that they may thereby be brought into society with those habits of industry that may render them useful citizens. And finally, they recommended to all the people under their care to use the most prudent measures consistent with the interest in the state of civil society in parts where they live to procure eventually the final abolition of slavery in America. There's no record of a great dissent or a protest voted on by the whole Presbyterian Church, North and South. Now, let's not pat ourselves on the back too much. It's a very gradual, it's a very moderate approach. It isn't saying go, it's saying let's train them, let's educate them. But it is a full-throated statement in 1787, again in 1794, saying we are for the final abolition of slavery. There is no statement here in the early period of Presbyterians saying, well, this peculiar institution is really a good thing and it's really a blessing to us. One of the most impressive things about Allen is that he was both an unflinching advocate for African Americans. He lobbied for their freedom. He defended them against opponents. He refused to back down in the face of discrimination, while at the same time, he developed deep friendships with whites, and he publicly thanked them for their support. I'll give you two examples. In 1799, Allen published 2 eulogies for prominent Southern white men who had come to support emancipation. You've heard of the first, George Washington. Now, he could have looked at George Washington and said he comes from the planter class, he had slaves his whole life, and sure, he set them free at the end, but he could have said, George Washington, bad guy. Instead, he says, Look, this is our first president. This is the father of our country, the most famous person. And you know what he did at the end of his life? He freed all of his slaves. Good guy. And look at that example. Don't you want to be like George Washington? And he provided for their education and for their support. He said, George Washington, at his death, he said, he was, quote, a sympathizing friend and tender father to free blacks. He noted that Washington himself had made a donation to Bethel Church when they were procuring the land and taking subscriptions. Quote, he viewed our degraded and afflicted state with compassion and pity, his heart not insensible to your sufferings. The other eulogy, someone probably haven't heard of, is a man called Warner Mifflin. Warner Mifflin was born in Virginia. He was a slave owner who became an ardent abolitionist. He freed his slaves in Delaware. He had his father free his slaves in Virginia. And Mifflin traveled the country speaking against slavery. In fact, he passed out Richard Allen's 1794 anti-slavery tract. Allen's eulogy for Mifflin was especially warm because they had spent time together, and he considered Mifflin a co-laborer in the gospel. So he didn't know Washington personally. He wasn't like, we are both preachers of Christ, but he believed that about this man, Mifflin. So in that biography, there's a chapter called Richard Allen, Mediator, sort of trying to speak to the black world and the white world and looking for opportunities for the two not to misunderstand each other. There's a striking example. In 1807, there was a very infamous grisly murder that took place. 2 free black men had murdered a white widow named Sarah Cross. They broke into her store, they closed the windows, they killed her, they rummaged through her belongings, and the country was incensed. And people saw this as, well, you can imagine what the conclusions they reached. This is why blacks cannot be trusted with freedom. Look at what they did here. And Allen met with the 2 men. They were found. The next year they were executed. Before they died, he met with them. He extracted a confession from them and expressions of remorse, and Allen took to print. Not to defend them. He certainly what they did was indefensible. But he wanted the public to know that this, in his mind, was not a racial crime. People were referring to the Black Death, which used to be the language for the plague, and they're saying, well, this is what will happen if you give blacks freedom, the Black Death. He used it as an opportunity to try to say, no, the problem here, he said, was not that they had freedom, but that they were, quote, slaves of sin. And then in the piece, he exhorted African Americans about the responsibilities of liberty. In a remarkable address, also in that book, called To the People of Color, he urged free blacks to forgive those who had mistreated them. And he said, we ought to give thanks, quote, for many of the white people who have been instruments in the hands of God for our good. This is a remarkable part of his character, that he exhorted people to look for virtue in others rather than dwelling on the evil that had been done to them. And so whites who had mistreated them said, you should forgive them and look for the examples of many good whites. And to black men who committed a horrendous crime, don't think that that's something that black people do to white people. That's what sinful people do. Come and bring this full circle back to Mother Bethel. When Bethel began in 1794, it was a part of the mainline Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, you've all heard that phrase, mainline. The mainline churches, that wasn't in use then, but the phrase mainline also comes from Philadelphia. From the beginning of the 20th century, it referred to all of the nice, historic, old Protestant churches that were on the rail main line out from Philadelphia to the leafy suburbs. Those were the mainline churches. And you have your Methodist church and your Presbyterian church and your Old Baptist church and your Episcopal church. That was the main line. So they wouldn't have used that term, but that's what it was. They were opposed by many people in the Methodist Episcopal Church. They thought the church Bethel was theirs, subject to their discipline. One elder sued Bethel in court for the right to rule the church. And it took a long time, but it ended up being a victory for Allen and other African Americans. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled against the elder, so this case has no standing. Bethel continued to grow, and Allen's movement continued to expand. By 1795, the congregation had gone from 42 to 121. A decade later, it was 450. In 1805, the church had to purchase a new property, or adjoining property, same corner, but adjoining property, construct a new and bigger building. In 1821 and 22, Bethel accounted for 8% of Philadelphia's total baptisms. So the church was growing at a faster rate even than the city, which was growing by leaps and bounds. Allen says that this new building could hold up to 3,000 worshipers, which must have been the case because in 1817, 3,000 blacks gathered into church to protest, here's another acronym, protest the founding of the ACS, the African Colonization Society. So this was one idea with how to deal with slavery. Okay, well, what do we do? Maybe they should be free, but some white leaders, a few black leaders, but not many. White leaders, well, go recolonize Africa. So where they came from, we'll send them back to Africa. Overwhelming number of blacks, Allen among them, were absolutely against this colonization scheme. And this is very telling. Why? Because in our day, you find people on both the left and the right who would disagree with this. Allen's basic argument was, we're Americans too. This is our country as much as anyone's country. And I say because you can find people on both polarities, both some people who say, well, you don't want this to be your country. You don't claim America. America's always been racist and supremacist. No, they said, this is our country. And then you have some people say, well, I don't know if they're real heritage Americans. Heritage Americans probably being some code for certain kinds of white Americans. They said, no, that may be our ancestry, but don't send us to Africa. This is our country. And they loved their country. Even though it had not always treated them well, they believed that the principles in the Declaration were there and for them and needed to be more fully embraced. As other black churches faced discrimination, church leaders believed it was time to form a separate denomination. They wanted to be on firm legal footing. There were always these legal challenges. Black Methodists in Baltimore faced similar challenges. So in 1816, Black Methodists from Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey gathered in Philadelphia and formed the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first black-led denomination in the United States. Soon, several thousand members in Charleston, South Carolina, left their Methodist congregations to join them. Allen became the denomination's first bishop. Because they're Episcopalian, they have bishops. He served in that role until his death in 1831. The first black bishop ordained in the United States. Some people say the first black bishop in the Western world, maybe the first black bishop in the world. And we can celebrate that and set aside that we're Presbyterians and don't believe in bishops. Richard Allen was married twice, from 1790 to 1801. He was married to Flora, who was a great help in his ministry. They had no children. 5 months after Flora died, he remarried Sarah Bass. Sarah was also born into slavery. At age 8, she was brought to Philadelphia. She procured her freedom by 1800. So she had just been free a year, and they were married in St. George's Church. It must say something about, they're back in the church. Remember, eventually, back in 1787, had said, you can't sit here. So there was really, it was always a tumultuous, depending on who the leaders were. Sometimes they got along, sometimes they didn't get along, but it says something. They got married in St. George's Church on August 18, 1801. They had 6 children. Sarah took a special interest in missions. Bethel would later found the Sarah Allen Missionary Society. She lived to be 85 years old, died in 1849. Richard Allen died on March 26, 1831. Philadelphia mourned, especially black Philadelphians, mourned him as a fallen hero. When his autobiography was published 2 years later, it was the first such work by a free black in the 19th century. Later, in 1853, so the sectional conflict is becoming more pronounced in this country, and blacks in New Orleans started founding educational institutions, started establishing churches, because they didn't want to exist in segregated organizations. A publication called the Pennsylvania Freeman, so is an abolitionist, boasted that the ghost of Richard Allen was haunting Louisiana. It is fitting, and here we close, that Allen ends his autobiography with the creation of the AME. He doesn't tell a lot of juicy stories from his life. He doesn't give a lot of personal windows into his soul. He tells about his conversion. He tells about Mother Bethel, and then he tells about the AME, and then it drops off. That's the story. And fitting because everyone agrees that is the most significant institutional legacy. And though he was an abolitionist, a writer, an advocate for black respect and uplift, he was above all a gospel preacher. The first black bishop in the United States, the first black-led denomination. One bishop in the church in 1865, as they gathered to celebrate Allen's birthday, the anniversary, said, "Rome had her Caesar, Germany her illustrious Luther, America her Washington, Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln. African Americans can claim their illustrious hero, Richard Allen." He not only established lasting black institutions, but also American institutions. He showed in his example the path he thought that blacks and whites should take. He was an advocate, piety, hard work, and prayer. He prized discipline for himself and for others. His approach to discrimination was prove the stereotypes wrong. Give us a chance, and we will show you we can be as smart and successful, as resourceful as anyone else. And when wronged, he preached forgiveness, and to use a modern term, nonviolence. He developed these separate institutions by necessity, and yet we've seen many examples where he voices strong appreciation for white leaders along the way who supported him, and even if they weren't where he wanted them to be, if they were moving in the right direction. He was stubborn, resourceful, took initiative, entrepreneurial. One author called him, this is a great 3-word phrase. Would that it would be true of more of us. Modesty without timidity. Modesty without timidity. He writes in his autobiography this little verse, short poem, which says something about the significance of his life and the church he founded. "The God of Bethel heard her cries. He let his power be seen. He stopped the proud oppressor's frown and proved himself a king. Thou saved them in the trying hour. Ministers and councils joined, and all stood ready to retain that helpless church of thine. Bethel surrounded by her foes, but yet not in despair. Christ heard her supplicating cries. The God of Bethel heard." Thus ends the story of Richard Allen, and he ought to be one of our Christian and even our American heroes to celebrate.